Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. Um, and we'll get straight into our first news topic here. Don't really have too many housekeeping topics. Um, so we'll start off with a bogus bug or a bad CVE. Z spotted this yesterday and knows a bit more of the context here than I do. So I'll let you go through this issue, Z, and then we'll talk about it.
All right, yeah. Unfortunately, the link didn't come up here, so I'm just trying to find that again. There we go. For anybody who's watching along with us. Yeah, so I guess Tom here has a blog and he put this out. It's kind of hacker news in Reddit, which is where I first came across it, but it's kind of a complaint with this Log Guru application. Core issue here is they had a CVE go out that had a critical rating 9.8, remote code execution, network accessible remote code execution, and it's because of this use of pickle. And if you're familiar with Python at all, pickle it's a well-known kind of dangerous sync. It's effectively you can deserialize if you depickle something. You can end up getting code execution in similar way with just code execution, but you can pickle kind of a lot more than you can with just standard deserialization. It's quite a dangerous thing to use, so anything anything untrusted going into pickle is a problem. So there was a bug report that came in. Ultimately, the author of the maintainer developer on Log Guru was like, how is this different from just having a class that calls like OS system and executes a command? Because all this code, or all his code was doing, was taking a class that already existed, um, and logging like this class, pickling it, logging it, and then bringing it back up or depickling it. You'll let me just double check here in the code. Got the patch open here. Yeah, basically just grabs the pickle of whatever self.value is. So basically, this is a class that's already in memory. So what it's pickling is if it's untrusted, if you've loaded an untrusted class, like it's already executing. Something's already loaded this thing. And then it's just taking that value, pickling it, using it. It's not, in my opinion, a huge issue unless it's were to be untrusted, but this got reported. And what ended up happening here, I think this was almost a year ago that the initial bug was reported. Yeah, January 12th, 2021. So over a year ago, the initial bug was reported. And their example here is just this arbitrary code class where they end up calling, the internal function there from pickled value to get it. So it's not a great bug in my opinion. So now where things get a little bit more interesting is, like I mentioned, they did go through, there was a patch for this. He patched it just straight up saying the commit message here is remove pickle.loads to comply with security tools. Kind of a passive aggressive statement there. And that's because this one person created an issue there saying like patch this potential exploit, and coming in on really pressured the developer here into fixing this issue, which the developer didn't understand how was an issue because there are other systems that do exactly the same thing. Why is his getting picked on basically for using pickle in this way where the issue is this other class? And where it does differ, because of course Log4j did just happen. Where it differs from that is that Log4j took untrusted code, and basically you'd have code execution from untrusted input. There was the untrusted aspect. This requires the class already be loaded. So something else has made a significant and serious, or has introduced a significant and serious vulnerability. And it's at that point, there's no real difference from having a class that just calls os.system. Like you're not gaining any new privileges. You already have Python execution at that point. If you have something malicious in there, like there's nothing new being gained here.
Yeah,
But they
basically in this case, in order to get Python code execution, you need Python code execution.
Yes. But they pushed on it, and the developer here asked reasonable question, like, can you show me how this is actually vulnerable? Like, it just got the response ended up basically being, well, it claims it is, and there's this example code that triggers it, which, is just calling the pickle thing directly. Um, so I want to bring this up more as just point of one, if you're going to report an issue, consider what the one attack scenario is. Like, how is this really going to be attacked in the real world? Because this is just one of those cases where you don't, as Spectre put it a lot simpler than I did, but you already need code execution to get code execution. There's no gain for this. You're already insanely trusted at that point, and you're not gaining anything by taking advantage of this issue. And the other thing is, and this is more just a question on my part, but the original report, I should have saved the Hunter dev link, but the original report ended up coming in on just like I want to say it was 3.8. So it had a low CVSS rating. It had things like the access condition was considered. I'm sure I can just Google this CV and get what the actual thing is. But the original report off Hunter dev was pretty low rated. I don't think it's a huge. Yeah, here we go. 3.8. So access condition high. CIA was all low. Again, I'm not a big fan of the issue, but at least at 3.8, it wouldn't have got pushed out as strongly as it was. As Amy mentions in chat, GitHub alerted a ton of people about this vulnerability. And yeah, that's true. Because this was CV, so anybody using this got this alert stating that there's this 9.8 super critical vulnerability in LogGuru that can't be hit. And in fairness, part of that is going to be a problem on, like, I think it's good that GitHub's alerting people of that sort of thing, that it's important to raise the awareness of the fact this vulnerability exists. In this case, though, it really just feels like a fake CV.
Yeah, not this vulnerability. Maybe other vulnerabilities, sure.
Yeah. I mean, as a
that
practice,
is
it's automated. I think it's fair.
okay. So yeah, that's maybe a bit of a discussion we can get into because I think that is an important point to bring up that we almost skipped over because that was I think what blew this issue to be more cared about than it otherwise would have been if it was just a bogus bug that was submitted that the researcher or the maintainer you know wasn't really certain on and there was this back and forth. I don't even think anyone really would have cared. But the
Well,
fact that the advisory went out for it is kind of what got people a bit angry about it, I
so the
guess.
advisory, and this is on the maintainer a little bit, but also the maintainer didn't completely understand the consequences of putting out this CV. So I don't know if maybe it was even his mistake that led to it having the 9.8. Because I was going to start getting here after talking about the 3.8 original report score versus the CVs filed at a 9.8 critical. And the developer mentioned that he didn't recognize that it was going to end up alerting everybody like that over the issue because he actually put off putting out an update for the vulnerability, not seeing it as worth like a urgent release. So then you had that CV go out, all of these alerts, plus there was no update path available, so that also kind of stirred things up a bit.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, if I had to summarize what this bug report or POC is trying to do, it feels like a really convoluted way of just doing like os.exec my code or whatever,
It
or
basically is.
popcalc.
I mean,
And
that's what
it's funny
Pickle lets you
because
do.
yeah, and I think the blog post even called this out that there's been a very similar report that was submitted to Microsoft that like popped calc, but it did so with this really convoluted process that you'd have to kind of look through the code to figure out exactly what's going on. But when you got down to it, it wasn't a bug; it was an intended control flow, and it's not somewhere you could ever get untrusted data into because, like you said, like half of the vulnerability is what is the path to exploiting it. Um, it always has to come from untrusted data in some way, shape, or form. So if you completely ignore that aspect and just pass in whatever you want, and the function's expecting trusted data, but in the real world, it's never used like that. Then it's not a useful issue. Um, I do feel like in a lot of these cases, it I don't think this was a mistake of a report. Like I don't think somebody just tried this and actually legitimately thought this was a bug and reported it. Um,
Oh,
this
I could
almost does seem to
understand.
fall into those categories of like beg bounties as they're called. But maybe I'm wrong. But it seems you have a counterpoint to that, so I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, and it's mostly just like I could understand somebody who hasn't worked with this time just seeing like, okay, this thing exposes pickle. It's not a well, I mean it's underscored, but you need the double underscore to really get something out of it. Um, I could understand like somebody coming along and thinking, hey, this, if something sensitive, or sorry, if something untrusted could reach this input, this is dangerous. This is something you should not be exposing. You just, in general, using pickle, and they actually mention it here, like, using pickle is in general kind of dangerous. Like that is a true statement. To be clear, I'm reading this comment from Aaron Klong. He was not the original reporter. He created the issue on GitHub asking for this to get patched because of his own company system, like alerting. His company's internal dependency auditing system is alerting on it. I think some of the comments, I believe, maybe thought that he was the reporter, but no, that was this anon artist user who kind of did the original report. I could understand somebody looking at this thinking that's dangerous without, if they don't fully understand what the library does, where things are coming from, just it exposes this dangerous function, therefore a developer could use this inappropriately. There is some space for that. I just, in this case, like it's a useful case for it. Like it's being used as an internal thing. It's not directly exposed, and it is a developer that would need to call it. But also, more importantly, in this case, is the fact that it is just pickling an object that is already loaded in memory. But still, I mean, I could understand not a developer, a researcher not understand maybe coming across that and this just being closed as an invalid bug. So I think both the developer not having a lot of familiarity with issuing CVs and then the researcher coming along reporting on this, kind of just leading to that perfect storm.
I agree on the perfect storm aspect. But the reason I'm a bit skeptical on the, you know, thinking this might have been like an accidental report and not understanding the control flow that had to happen here for this to be exploitable is you would kind of like, if you understand how pickle works and what's going on in this code, then you would kind of, it's already a given that you would have to control the class that's being passed in here. I mean, like
Yeah, I
it's
mean, you
directly in the
do.
POC. So
Um,
it seems a little weird to me that you would somehow miss that fact that you would have to
yeah,
get a class that's already loaded passed in there. But
yeah,
I
that's
don't know.
fair. I mean, I'm trying to be charitable, but I could also definitely see this as being. I don't like to jump to just asserting that it's malice. I can understand a side view, but I would agree this does look like that sort of just big bounty type of thing where it's just here's some issue that maybe they'll pay me out on or not. Because I believe see, that's the other thing. I thought hunter.dev had like you had to submit patches also. I thought that was the deal with hunter.dev.
That'd be a
I'm
cool
just getting
requirement
taken to.
to
Oh, I
LinkedIn.
must have. I think I just typoed the domain.
Oh,
Yeah, I
okay.
get paid to find and fix vulnerabilities, and I thought they just I thought you had to submit patches. Maybe you just get an extra bounty if you do that. I'm not entirely familiar with Hunter. They reached out to us a long time ago about being on the podcast and then just never followed up.
Oh,
So I looked it up back then, and that's all.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah, so I mean, maybe this is a bit of too much of a tangent, and maybe we don't want to talk about this too much, but um, that is actually a really interesting point with the having to submit a patch for bounties. I feel like that would prevent a lot of these types of reports that are
No, it
time
wouldn't.
wasters in a sense from getting
Oh,
through.
It
You
would
really
just
don't think
result
so?
in stupid patches. You'll
Okay.
get the same sort of issue, and somebody will just have like this simple patch. Okay, let's just remove pickle, and you'll get extra work.
Okay. Maybe you're a bit more cynical on it than I am, because I feel
Whereas
like
before I was being optimistic.
I know we've switched sides. So I've seen a lot of reports, like, especially well, pretty much exclusively in open source projects that are like, um, they point out this vulnerability or they submit some crash that they had, but then they don't want to do any of the legwork on doing like the root causing or how it would be patched or anything like that. And these maintainers just get bogged down with those reports. You see it heavily in Linux, for example. Um, or you get reports that are not vulnerabilities like this one, but you kind of have to do that work to prove that it's not a vulnerability. Whereas you would hope that it would go in the other direction, that you would have to prove that it is. And I feel like having that extra work requirement on the report of having to construct a patch would act as sort of a filter for some of these reports.
And so I don't
Just
know how
because it would be
long
so much more work to fake it from the submitter's point of view.
I don't know how long we want to go into that discussion, but I would kind of disagree just because and this is so I would agree that creates more work and thus might cut down on the input, or it could lead people just they won't do research on that project because they need to do this extra work. I mean, because imagine the scenario where everybody actually had to submit a patch for every bug they found. Suddenly, every bug you find takes a lot more work, and that's something that really the developers should be doing. You need to know their coding style, their expectations for the code, have a lot better understanding of the entire ecosystem of that code base. So, like, I wouldn't support the idea that you just should submit a patch with every bug. I just thought that was something that Hunter did, or they had something involved with, or maybe it was just like you could get payment for providing patches too, or patches were some that they would pay out on. Um, as a general system of requiring patches, though, I feel like patches really are better done by the developers, and I don't think it would actually lead to less big bounties.
Okay. I can see kind of what you're saying there, and yeah, that is a fair point with understanding the code base, because if it's a complex code base and there's assumptions being made other like in other places in the code, then the developers will be much better suited to handle that. Um I
Like
just know
it's
personally.
unfortunate for the devs to need to spend that time. I completely agree with you on like being bogged down by bug reports, but at the same time, like it's a different job. It's a different type of work, and somebody who's good at finding issues might not be that great at patching them.
Yeah, it's just I feel like the biggest problem with these kind of bug bounties, and it's kind of a contributing factor in this case as well, is just that triaging is it's so difficult for and adds so much work on developers that it's easy to feel pressured into
It
just
does.
saying screw
It's
it, let's just do it. Like let's just patch this issue or whatever they think is this issue and move on.
it's a
Um
real issue. I completely agree there.
yeah. So it'd be nice to see some kind of solution to that. I don't know if there is one. Um, you know.
Managed programs. I mean, that's what you've got with like HackerOne. You can have their triagers kind of deal with that for you, but I don't actually know where. I assume there's like monthly payment or maybe per bug payment to HackerOne. I don't actually know what that side of the business looks like, but I assume it's not a good option for just an open source project.
Yeah, it's a little bit too inaccessible for them. So yeah, the smaller developers in the open source community, it's hard to not feel bad for them when they have to deal with um,
Just
vulnerability
just write
reports.
your
Like,
code right the first time.
yeah, you know, if we just used Rust, we wouldn't have these problems. So I do love bringing up that meme at every opportunity, as our regular listeners probably know by now. But yeah, all right. So I guess we can move on to our exploits here, if unless you wanted to add something, Z.
Well, our exploits, if you want to call this one that, going from one questionable bug to another. This one, I was actually surprised that this one got a payout. It was only a $200 bounty, so not like an amazing payout, although it was rated as medium severity. And I'm actually, I kind of wanted to bring this up in case somebody sees something that I'm missing with it. This is on Omise, and there's a cross-site scripting through the X forwarded host header. Generally, that's a header being used by like the reverse proxy to indicate what the original host was as it proxies it along. Similar to X forwarded 4 would give you the original requesting IP. As when you have the proxy, you kind of lose some of that information. In this case, like they use the example, just direct cross-site scripting, bing.com, quote, angle brackets, and then going right into an image tag to get this script. Basically, I don't see how this could be exploited at all. I'm kind of curious if other people would consider this to be a self XSS. Now, self XSS, I feel like this is self XSS usually either opening the console or like it's stored XSS in your own account and you can't like share the link to anybody. This one, it very much feels like a sort of self attack. I could understand coming up with some contrived way that you could add this header, but the only way to add this header in like a JavaScript request would be after a CORS pre-flight. So you would have to have CORS allowing it. No mention of that for what it's worth. The other attack vector would be cache poisoning. If this were to be keyed on being the original host and then displayed like the cross-site scripting, you can do it with cache poisoning. No mention of cache poisoning either. But I look at this report and I don't see how it's being attacked, and maybe it's not, but self access is considered out of scope. This one still gets paid out. And I mean, it's an interesting header though, just to look for issues at. Like I said, cache poisoning is totally possible with this, and I think we've either covered it or at least I've seen some abusing X forwarded host for cache poisoning. Morpheus in chat also mentioned these kind of reports are incredibly bad since beginners would look at this and report it if they encountered something similar. And that's a good point. Like, we do have people looking at these reports just like we are here, and you're like, hey, I've seen this same issue. Why don't I submit it here? And then they don't get paid, and then perhaps complaining, perhaps just having a bad experience because they thought they had an issue that ultimately ended up not being an issue. I mean, as researchers, I think we need to take the time again to understand what the attack vector is, similar with the last one. Like, how do you get into a position to actually exploit this issue? What are the requirements there? And that kind of shows there isn't much. At the same time, they got paid out on this. Like, this was profitable for them, basically.
So the cache poisoning attack is a fair call out because I didn't really think about that when I was reading it because
It's not mentioned
yeah,
at all. Like,
yeah.
I don't think it's the case here.
Because, like you, when I was reading it, I was thinking, like, how could this actually be attacked? Because, most XSS are going to work through, like, a URL or something that you can send somebody and have them open it through phishing. Header requests aren't something that can really be controlled without using, like, a malicious browser or maybe a malicious extension could add a header on. But then, if you have a malicious extension or client installed, you already have bigger problems than an XSS. So, yeah, the cache poisoning is the only like reasonable way I could see this maybe being attacked, and even then, it would be kind of context specific. Like if it does any like I don't know. Have we seen many cases where the caching has not keyed the forwarded host header?
So the case that's actually coming to mind for me was in, I think it was a Symphony, where they mishandled or something would handle X forwarded host header. So it was a potential cache poisoning. We didn't cover a case where it actually was used. It's still a relatively recent header to be seen, like to be used. In terms like even being supported by the end applications. It is relatively recent. At least in my experience. Maybe people have been using it forever and I just never really came across it. Uh, but yeah, I don't think we've covered it specifically, but we've covered issues kind of surrounding it or related to it. You can imagine a case where the header's overlooked.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'd put it. Is it doesn't seem like something that's likely, but I guess it's possible depending on the setup. Um, but yeah, like you said, like that's not pointed out anywhere in the report. But yeah, I mean, it makes the report a little bit more reasonable, I guess, if you consider the cache poisoning vector. It's
I'd
too
have
bad it's not
expected
really
them to
mentioned.
mention it then.
Yeah.
Because
Um,
cache poisoning itself is its own issue that could be, paid out on. Or maybe they do have another report open or something.
yeah. So I guess we'll jump into our next HackerOne report, which is a little bit more of a real bug, I guess. Um, it's kind of it's in this service called FetLife, which is a kink-focused social network, we'll say. This bug is more of a denial of service kind of issue where by getting malicious markdown links created on a post or in a comment or something, you can break the markdown processing for the entire page and get a 500 error served, which you could use to deny access to someone's post or timeline. The
And I
issue that
think
caused the denial of service was basically just the markdown processor not being able to handle invalid encoding in the link text. Go ahead, Z.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that I think this one, the fact that you can kind of censor posts is what makes it a really interesting attack. So yeah, it's denial of service, usually not that impactful. In this case, so one, if this were actually getting used, I mean, the fact that it's a 500 error is probably going to get picked up. And so if this were being used to actually like censor somebody, probably not going to last that long. But I mean, long enough for something, especially if it were used in moderation, like just on one person's like comments on their profile or something. I'm not too familiar with the site, but assuming they have something like that, like censoring their profile, suddenly nobody can hit it. It's just an occasional 500, so it could be looked over in logs. You could have some fun with this, and just as an issue, it's kind of a fun issue. All of these character encoding things, in this case, it's basically you have a character that doesn't decode into anything valid. Um, so languages like Python, especially, or at least that's where I've run into it a lot. You create some shell code, and then Python's like, "Screw you! This isn't a real character. I'm not doing anything with this." Um, you're kind of left where Python will crash. Some languages will just crash on you, crash and burn, and that makes it kind of a fun little attack to look for. And I hadn't even really thought of it in this context. Trying some weird characters in other places, but just in this context, like it's just something that personally I was in testing a lot for, and it really only comes up in my mind when I'm dealing with like a blacklist I'm trying to get around. It's blocking me. I've already got an issue. I'm just trying to find my way around it. Then I'm trying these character encodings. And just having it as part of the routine testing, I think is a great idea. And it just kind of reminded me of that when I read this report. Like, it's just a great little bug. I mean, it was only, again, $100 bounty, so not like a huge thing. But as a bug class, you could see this pop up in a lot of places because some languages just really hate these bad characters.
Yeah, another one of those things that's kind of context specific. Um, and yeah, like that's why the researcher who reported this, Castillo, mentioned that they were fuzzing the markdown for this issue. And yeah, markdown is one of those things where it seems like it escapes notice more often than other places, perhaps, when doing like any web rendering or whatever. Because markdown is somewhat complex to parse. And we've seen issues before in like markdown parsing that have caused XSS through denial of service and whatever else. So yeah, it just seems like one of those vectors. It's not really thought about as much, I guess. Um,
I would kind of disagree there. Actually, when I see Markdown, when I see BB code, when I see anything that's going to be processing text or input into HTML, it does trigger my interest because it's generating HTML. So Markdown generates it to HTML, BB code, restructured text, all of those things.
yeah, maybe it's just a
Personally,
case
do
of it being so common. So just by
yeah,
nature of it being so common, that's why you see more reports about it. Could be that too.
yeah. I mean, it's hard to get it right. Like there are a lot of cases that you need to kind of be thinking about with it. That said, at the same time, a lot of the code bases actually use like fairly mature libraries for it that have been tested pretty well. So
Yeah,
some of the issues you tend to see aren't necessarily the most straightforward. Although sometimes they are, like all of the mermaid cross-site scriptings we've been covering lately.
yeah, a lot of edge cases that have to be handled there. So yeah, I mean, another straightforward bug, but at least this one has more practical implications than some of the other ones we've covered in the episode. Um, yeah. Um, like you said, this would be fairly detectable if you used it in like any capacity. If there's any monitoring going on by the developers, they're going to be able to see, okay, there's 500 error. Let's take a look at what content is on that page, and they'd probably find it pretty quickly. But yeah, it could still be an annoying issue for sure. Up next, we have a write up from Sudhakar Muthumani. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Detailing an info disclosure in Microsoft's research portal. And the issue here is pretty interesting because it's kind of an IDOR in a way, but a little bit more involved than that, I guess. So basically, with Microsoft's research portal for bug reports and whatnot, as you'd expect, they have an ID attached to the reports. And while that ID is unique, it's not a secure unique identifier. It's iterative, so it's pretty easy to guess a valid report ID given that you already have one. It seems Microsoft does some automated parsing of emails to their vulnerability report email, where if the subject line is equal to vuln dash and then the ID, um, it will like automatically tag you in to that vulnerability report. The problem is Microsoft doesn't seem to check or verify that the sender of that email is actually supposed to be part of that report chain. So by just sending an email to the Microsoft vulnerability report email with some vuln ID subject, you automatically get tagged into that report and you receive updates on that report surreptitiously. So it's kind of a cool bug. It seems the impact is a bit limited because the way that I read this is you would just receive the updates to the report. I don't think you'd receive the original report itself, which in some cases, like the updates to the report may be enough to deduce the details of the bug in question, especially if there's a POC being passed back and forth or something. But it's kind of context specific. If you don't have useful updates going back and forth on that chain, or if you're too late and there's no updates anymore, then obviously you're not really going to be able to get anything. But still, a very like weird bug to have, especially from the Microsoft research portal. That's not really a place I'd expect to find such a weirdly simple issue as just being able to tag yourself into reports like that.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's the thing that struck me with this one is again, it's a really simple issue in like a security sensitive context. Now, I'm not sure if they had full access or not. Like I said, they mentioned user B can receive updates of the bug report without their knowledge, but also mentions that user B is added to the ticketing portal of Microsoft. So it sounded to me like they may have access to the reports too through the portal. Um, Although maybe that just isn't clear. 'Cause like I said, it is mentioned later on that they receive updates, and if they did have full access, it feels like that would have been something that they would really call out on and emphasize here.
because that would be a big factor in how useful this would be. Because pretty much all of the information that you would want to, like, if you were trying to look for 0 days that weren't yet patched or something, then you would want the original post because that's going to have most of the technical details that are relevant to the report, obviously. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like you said, I would think they would have called that out if that was possible, but um, not 100% certain on that.
Yeah, and but again, it's a simple bug and it's something I could imagine existing in a number of other places.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, and yes, Sarsec in chat called out kind of lame they didn't pay for that. So yeah, sorry, I can't remember if we mentioned this earlier, but yeah, Microsoft didn't award a bounty for this issue because they deemed it as out of scope. It does seem a little like weird to me. I feel like this is one of those cases where they should have paid out because it's it's a fairly significant bug. I mean, especially for someone like Microsoft who's managing, Windows and all and these majorly used products. Um, this would be an attack that would be useful to like threat actors out there who are looking for some quick bugs they could weaponize before they get patched. Though, yeah, I'm not really a big fan of that decision. That even though, like, even if technically it does fall out of scope, I feel like an exception should have been made here. Um, but obviously that's up to Microsoft. They're running the bounty. If it does fall out of scope in their terms, then they can choose to treat it like that. But yeah, I think it is pretty shitty that they didn't choose to pay out here,
Yeah,
honestly.
I somewhat agree. Kind of depends on why it was out of scope. If this was something where they said, well, like this sort of email issue or something is considered out of scope, like this type of attack, versus like the whole research portal is just out of scope. So, one, I would disagree with having the research portal as out of scope for testing. But if that were the case, and okay, the researcher kind of knows that going into it, this is out of scope. Like this, you're testing on something that's completely out of scope. But if it is something where it's just like research portal is, but they don't like there's a bug or like it wasn't impactful enough to be considered like in scope. If it was just the updates or something, that's where I would agree. Like it's kind of lame not to pay it out. Again, if it is the whole research panel that's out of scope, I get it being Microsoft's decision. I disagree with it, but I get it.
All right, so we'll get into our next topic here, which is in Zoho. So this is also kind of a design level issue
Oh,
that was detailed by.
I've actually got a Little Snitch first.
Oh yeah, sorry, you're right. I somehow I got lost in my own notes. Okay, yeah, we'll go to Little Snitch, then we'll get to Zoho. We'll save that. So yeah, like Z said there, next issue is actually in Little Snitch, which is a well respected and well liked macOS host based firewall. In the introduction paragraph, Rhino Security Labs claims it's actually so good that some malware in the past has uninstalled itself when it detects a system is running Little Snitch. So that was kind of a neat little tidbit in there that I thought was cool. What Little Snitch primarily does is it'll let you know whenever an application is trying to reach out to an unknown host. And when this happens, you're prompted with an alert to allow it with some other options like allow once or for a certain amount of time or whatever. And just on that domain or if the application can connect anywhere. So it's useful for trying to discover if you have some malware that's trying to communicate with a CNC or something. So obviously, in order to do all of this, it's going to be monitoring network traffic. It's checking for any data that's going over to an untrusted host from an untrusted application. And if it detects data going to an IP, it'll alert you and prompt you. What leads to this issue is it doesn't alert at the first TCP packet when the connection is established. It only starts to do that monitoring and alerting when data is sent over the socket that's already connected. And this is intentional because it's required for supporting like domain to IP connection features. So the clever attack here is you can use the destination port as a sort of side channel. So if you need to exfiltrate data to an attacker server as a piece of malware, um, you don't necessarily need to be able to send data over the socket. The socket connections in and of themselves can be used as a side channel because you can encode data in the form of what ports you can connect with. Now, obviously, that is going to be very slow. It's your data transmission rate is going to be like insanely lower than if you could just send data over a socket, but it's going to be pretty much impossible to detect by software like Little Snitch. So yeah, very clever and cool trick, and I could definitely see it being used in some specific cases.
Yeah, like this is
Um,
definitely more of like a red teamer's trick to know about. They're mostly the ones I would imagine kind of landing on someone's MacBook and then needing to deal with this versus like a server running it or something, which I imagine would have a more robust tool for this. I just thought it was fun though, the fact that Little Snitch wasn't blocking them and they have their reasons for it, and thus this also isn't getting patched. But it's an interesting way around it because you intuitively would expect it to like block the connection too, not just once data is being sent. And yeah, you're able to get around that using I mean, you could maybe get even faster by taking advantage of more ports. So say having the reception port actually be the first 2 bytes. I think you've got like the 65 whatever thousand uh possible ports. Like you can maybe send more data than just going bit by bit as they do here using 8 ports for the receiver. Uh but yeah, I mean ignoring that aspect, I just thought it was an interesting issue to have. And I can't it's maybe not going to help you if you're doing bug bounty, but still cool for the red teamers out there.
The stealthy nature of it is what's really cool.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if this is really the best comparison, but I couldn't help in my mind but think or compare this a little bit to like the Spectre, the CPU speculative execution type side channel bugs, just in the way that this is something that, like you commented on earlier, isn't going to be fixed in the foreseeable future. It is kind of that design level issue that um, in order to patch this effectively, you would have to break other features, which they don't want to do. So yeah, I mean it's a cool attack, and it's pretty much unfixable at least for the moment, unless they do like a major overhaul on. Even then, I don't even know if it would really be possible if they still wanted to like support domain to IP.
Yeah, if there
So
are features that they need, then I mean, it's really just the trade-off they make to allow it. I mean, maybe having a feature that lets you disable it and choose not to even allow that much. But it really depends on what you're doing. I think in most scenarios, it's just going to be malware trying to connect out, so it's more than sufficient for like your average end user who just is maybe facing a little bit of malware and being like, hey, this program really shouldn't be making a connection at all. It's
yeah,
just when you get the red team or when you get more of a advanced persistent threat, then you start seeing a technique like this maybe being useful. Starsack also mentioned in the chat you can maybe do a timing side channel where the time you keep the connection alive leaks data, which is another possibility too.
that's another cool attack. Though it'd probably be like even lower transmission rate than this one. But yeah, I mean that's another viable vector. If this vector for some reason stopped working, or if they found a way to mitigate it, then yeah, you could do a timing based attack too. Yeah. Um, and Sarsak also mentioned, I'm guessing you'd need elevated privileges to influence bits in the actual TCP header. Yeah, I think you would, if you were going to
Yeah,
try
you
to
need a raw
abuse the bits in the
socket.
header, yeah, you would need a raw socket, and those are going to be privileged off. Um, I don't know if there's something you could do with like ICMP packets, maybe, because those are kind of over raw sockets, but you don't really yeah, no, I don't think so. I don't think you could really use ICMP like that. So, yeah. If you had, if you were able to get an application ran as root though, which I mean, if you're malware and you're able to get root, like that is a viable scenario, then yeah, you could use raw sockets and probably exfiltrate data through the like the connection headers. Yeah,
You could also
that's a
probably
fair shout.
kill Little Snitch at that point.
Maybe. I mean, when you're talking about macOS, there are some like complicated permission structures that I think do go
True.
above root a little bit.
Well,
Um,
I mean, more. I think it's more in the same sense as like on Windows, you've got the user account control. Um, like I think on Mac, you've got like TCC and stuff where it's like it's a privilege layer of like a user interface, but it's not really a privilege layer.
it's not considered a security pounder.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not totally certain on the like the setup of how Little Snitch is ran, but yeah, that's true. It's possible that you could just kill Little Snitch outright. Um, although that might lead to suspicion too, though. I mean, if
Sure, I'm
somebody's
just
running Little
saying
Snitch, they're
like
probably gonna check that it's running and whatnot. So
or it's just running in the background. I'm just saying like when you're root, it is kind of a game over scenario.
it is a very powerful foothold. Yeah. But I still think it's worth calling out. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
good show.
It's still fun to think about those things. You never know when you kind of run into the scenario where it matters. I
Yeah,
mean, maybe there is something you can do without root, or you just have a particular capability or thing of Linux here, but uh, having access to one particular thing, how do you abuse it? So, I mean, completely valid.
Yeah, it's a good trick to have in the back pocket. All right, so we'll move into our last topic here, which is a design level issue detailed by Source Insight in Zoho's ManageEngine Desktop Central products. The vulnerability here is sort of how filters are applied on untrusted data. Particularly, well, there's a few issues here. The first one is in the state filter in this case, because the state filter can take a forward path from the request and use it to forward the user to somewhere else.
Yeah,
Given that
and
valid state cookies are set, which is possible to do as an attacker. Go ahead,
yeah,
Z.
a lot of this report ends up focusing on, like, a good chunk of it is about the code path that needs to be passed in order to reach that forward pathing. Um, which ultimately is just like it's coming out cookies, it's coming out of the request itself. And the issue being just it can do this forwarding. I mean, uh the guy who created Source Insight, who I think is, I don't know how many researchers they actually have hired, but if you're familiar with OSWE from OffSec, after creating the OSWE course, he went off. There's now a training course by Source Insight. So like the style of, I could tell that there's a similar authorship going on here, just in the way that they walk through the code. And it spends a lot of time just walking through. Here's how you pass through all the code. But the core issue comes back to just what you said. You get that forward path out of the request itself, and it performs this forwarding, like gets the dispatcher for whatever path you give it and just forwards you right off to it very early on. So just inside this filter chain, ignoring any other filters that would happen. And because it's going finding just whatever dispatcher can work for, this new or this, sorry, because it's doing the forward, sorry. Um, when it does that forward, it'll basically send it off to whatever servlet or anything else that's hittable there without regards to firewall that might exist beforehand, without regards to any other filters that might implement the authentication that might otherwise block it. It just sends it right along off where you want, which makes it a pretty powerful primitive once you realize kind of how to get there. Which then exposes the two actual kind of or more impactful vulnerabilities, although in my opinion less interesting vulnerabilities.
Yeah, on the note of like how the blog post was written and how they detailed the control flow of getting to the vulnerability, I won't lie, I did spend like 5 or 10 minutes when I was first reading this thinking the vulnerability was in like the process state function. Like there was some variable that was getting parsed from the cookie state that was being used or something, but no, they were just talking about how you could actually get past all the checks that were being done in order to get to that forwarding, like you were saying. Um, yeah. Interestingly, the authors of this post knew about this issue back in 2019, but they sat on it because they didn't have a vector to chain it with, and ultimately they weren't able to make it into a useful attack. But they noticed they had collision with a threat actor when the FBI published a flash alert in December of 2021, and the indicators of compromise and technical details hinted that this bug was in use in that chain. So Source Insight dug in and they discovered the threat actors were chaining with a directory traversal in the agent log upload servlet. As you can guess, the post request handler for that servlet would take user supplied parameters to build up a file path for a zip file, and it'll write user controlled data there. While the file name is checked for traversal, this other variable, local dir to store, which is built up using other request parameters, isn't. So yeah, you could chain the arbitrary forward to gain access to the agent log upload servlet, and then get an arbitrary zip, gzip or 7-zip file written to any directory. There are some significant limitations on this attack, though, which the blog post points out. For one, the state filter arbitrary forward is limited in that it can reach servlet endpoints, but it can't reach REST APIs or action forward classes. And the directory traversal only allows writing of those zip file types. And that vector was patched earlier than the arbitrary forward as well. The threat actor chain also required the server to be restarted before it could carry out the attack because the way they use the um, directory traversal zip upload, I believe, was to get a malicious jar file overwritten to overwrite core classes and basically like embed a backdoor. So when it was loaded upon server restart, it would load a malicious class and get malicious attacker code executed.
Yeah.
Because
That's
of
exactly how it went. I do want to jump back really quickly. I can see you remind me there. I might have been a bit quick speaking. With the redirect that happens early on. So this will let you. It'll basically restart as a new request, so you can forward this off to a servlet that you might not have access to. But I do believe it won't keep running any of the existing filters. But I think when you hit the new one, you will end up hitting. It'll rerun any filters on that other servlet that you hit. So that's why they couldn't access the API endpoints. At least that's how I would understand what's going on here. It's not explicit, but my understanding of how this works is that that's why, because then you would still need to pass through all of the normal filters for those API endpoints, whereas something like this log upload servlet doesn't really have anything. It's just expecting not to be exposed in the first place.
Yeah. One of those soft targets that are on the inside because they're not expecting to really be hit. So yeah, because of the limitations that I mentioned a bit earlier, Source Insight wanted to see if they could find a better strategy to hit this, in the form of like a different servlet or whatever, and they did with the change Amazon password servlet. Um, when that servlet would run, like it would accept a request, it would call change default AWS password to use the user supplied password credentials, which like right away the blog post kind of points out like, okay, what's the use in being able to change an Amazon password? That doesn't seem super useful. But when you looked at that change default AWS password function, it would implicitly call auth password, which is used for other functionalities like the manager services as well. So it would change the password for more than just the like AWS stuff, I guess. So using that, you could reset an admin password and literally just open a shell as system. So yeah, that was a more clean attack route that didn't require as many conditions to line up to take advantage of it. The thing is, though, that even though that is a much nicer attack scenario than the one that was discovered in the wild, it would also be more loud because an admin account's password being changed would be pretty noticeable, I think, and it would be pretty suspicious on. Like the admin would probably be pretty suspicious there. So
You would
yeah,
hope they
it
would
is.
be.
You would hope, yeah. So in the wild, I honestly think that even though this other attack they mentioned would be like cleaner and wouldn't require as many conditions to line up, it's probably less useful actually, just because of how much louder it is. So, yeah, but there is kind of that different path, and that's cool that they went down that route,
Yeah,
exploring it.
it depends on your goals.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, that's basically all the vulnerabilities we have for this week. Z, if you want to add anything onto that topic or any others, I'll let you go ahead, and if not, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
Nope, no shoutouts for this week.
All right, cool. So thank you to everyone who tuned in. As always, the VOD will be up on platforms like YouTube tomorrow. You can also find previous episodes up on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Anchor. Feel free to check out our Discord or follow us on Twitter for when we go live or for any discussion. Links for those are down below or in the chat. Tomorrow, we'll be back with our binary episode at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific, and we'll see you all then.